This video is going to talk about code analysis reports, and our goal is to show how easy and helpful it is to get a free code analysis report, or as we say, a CAR. The report will help you make the decision whether you want to switch to isCOBOL or not, and it will give you specifics about how compatible your code is with isCOBOL. This will give you an idea of the effort that it would take to make the switch. It's easy to order one, and it's completely free. Now here's the normal steps in our code analysis report. You send us your programs that you want us to compile, 3 or 4, along with the copybooks that we need for a successful compile. And if you have a configuration file or a compile script, then you should send us that too. And we figure out which compile switches to start with using our documentation's transition guides that's specific to your current COBOL, along with your current compile switches and variables. And we try to compile your programs with those switches. Now, quite often we find that we don't have all the copybooks we need, and there's usually some back and forth with you to get them. And then we deal with whatever compile problems come up. We'll write a report for you, and we'll present it during a call. And then we'll send all of the supporting files to you so you can start your own evaluation. Now, here are some common issues that we deal with during the CAR. isCOBOL returns 3 levels of errors. Warnings are just for the developer's information. Errors are the problems that we found, but the compiler will work around them to create the class file. And severe errors that will stop the class from getting created. We look at the warnings and these errors, and if we decide that it won't change the outcome of the compile or the runtime, we'll set a variable to block these from reporting. I'm going to show you that in the demo. Now, sometimes there are small syntax differences, and we can change those in the compiler's configuration file using regular expressions to change one syntax to another. Or we've just added a compiler preprocessor step, so we can write a program to change, remove, or add lines to the source code as it's getting compiled. If you use a precompiler like Oracle Pro COBOL or DB2's Pre, we usually just compile it with our regular compiler. It contains an all-purpose ESQL engine that's highly compatible with all of the databases and will replace that precompile step that you did. If the code returns severe programming errors, we're going to try to compile it with your current compiler and see if a compiler's there. We've got several versions of different COBOL vendors' compilers. And sometimes there are problems that we find that are actual programming problems, but other compilers didn't catch the error. For example, one prospect spelled standard incorrectly in several of their programs, but their current compiler didn't even notice it, and our compiler did. So in the case on the slide here, we fixed that with a regular expression in the configuration file, so we didn't have to change the code. We try very hard not to change the code that you send us. Now, when we find all the warnings and errors and syntax differences that I talked about on the last slide, we'll often open an internal development ticket on it and try to get it added to the next version. Sometimes the change is more extensive or very esoteric, and we'll wait until the prospect becomes a customer, or someone else asks for the same support before we schedule it to be done. But if possible, we will add that compatibility just to improve our product so that the next person that comes along doesn't have that issue. The default environment for a CAR is the command prompt using our SDK. However, if the prospect wants to use the IDE, we can do that too. Occasionally we get someone that wants to continue to use their IDE that they've been using all along, usually Eclipse or AccuBench, sometimes Totem. We support all 3 of these environments, and we can help you configure them to run isCOBOL. So which programs should you send? Well, we urge you to send the most convoluted, strangely programmed, or largest source code that you have to us for your CAR. The CAR is a tool for you to not only help you decide to move to isCOBOL, but also to get you started on your conversion project with the right compile switches, the right environment, and the right expectations for how long it will take to do the conversion. We have a boilerplate non-disclosure agreement, but we're usually happy to sign your version instead. We promise not to share this information with anyone. I'm going to show you some CARs that we've done, and I've either taken the customer's name off or gotten their permission to show you the document. And remember, we don't run your code. We just compile it. We don't need your data files. Also, if your code uses a DLL or an ActiveX control, for instance, we're not going to run it. We're not going to need them. We're not going to address the issues. However, we're going to cover some information about that at the end of the CAR, and we offer full support for you during the evaluation period when you might look at these issues. So let's take a look at this. I have a CAR that I've done recently. I've changed the name to Ajax, and they sent me an app survey form, their isCOBOL configuration file, several source codes, and 2 copybook folders. There are way more copybooks than I need here, but that's fine. I'd rather have more than less. The application survey form told me a lot of information that I needed. Number of users, the current COBOL vendor, and most importantly for the CAR is the compile string that they use, so I know which switches they use. I took those switches and I looked at the transition guide here, and I went through and decided which one of these switches were needed and what to do with their current switches, whether to use the same thing or to do something different. All the information is here in the transition guide. And then I created a compile properties file and added isCOBOL compiler options, and the options that should always be used when they compile their programs I put here. So we have this line of compiler switches. One of them is going to put the classes in isc_object. And then I created a batch file to compile with, and that looks like this. I'm adding my compile properties that I showed you earlier. And I'm also specifying that I want a list file, and I want the errors to go into an error file. And then for my copybooks, I'm including all of those copybooks that they sent. Then I opened up my command prompt and I ran the compile batch file. And I want everything in the source folder that ends with src. Now I'm going to take a look at everything that was returned, and I can see that they pretty much fall in 2 areas. We have a warning, number 254, that the procedure name is the same as the data name. This is just to let the developer know it's not going to affect the class at all. So I can safely ignore this warning. And you see I have it in several different places. The other warning that I have that I want to look at right now is 211. Variables declared in the linkage isn't in the using clause. Again, this is perfectly okay. It's just a warning to let the developer know that this unusual occurrence is there and they might want to do something with it. But in this case, I can safely ignore it. So I can ignore warnings 254 and 211. So I'm going to go to my properties file, and I'm going to block those warnings so that they won't be returned. And I do that by setting isCOBOL compiler message level for that number to 0. So I did it for 254 and 211. Let's save that. And let's run this again. Much better. So now I have some ambiguous identifiers. And I think that any COBOL is going to complain if you've defined a variable twice. So I want to check that. They say that isCOBOL is their current COBOL. So I'm going to go into my source folder, and you see I have an isCompile.bat, and this is the command line that they said that they used. And so I'm going to try to compile that program with isQ. And I get an ambiguous identifier for all of those. So now I know that this is a program they probably haven't looked at in a while and maybe made some changes to, but didn't use. And that's fine, but it tells me that it's okay to go in and change the program. So I did that. I went in and changed the program, and I have an MR121-mod, and I just commented out the variables that were in the program as well as in one of the copybooks. So I'm going to move this to the source folder, And I'm going to move the source, the one that's in the source folder, out. And we'll compile again. And that looks a lot better. So now I have a pretty good idea of what it takes to compile these programs. The other thing that I want to do before I complete my code analysis report is remember that they sent a configuration file called prof.fle. And for isCOBOL, we have a utility that will convert that. It's called isconfig. And I'm going to pass their configuration file, and I'm going to create a new one called runtime.properties. And there it's done. So let's look at those two and the differences between them. For instance, here's a file status. They want to use the 74 file status. This is how they set it in ACU, and we've converted it for isCOBOL. So when I was done with all that, then I created the AJAX CAR, or Code Analysis Report document. And I told them what the goal was, their list of programs. I told them all of the compile switches that I put into compile.properties and what they do, and all of the compile switches in the batch file and what they do. I told them what results I got from compiling them and what I had to do to get this result, which was block those 2 warnings. And that I had to actually change a program. I told them why. I put the output of isCOBOL here and the output of isCOBOL to show that this was not a compatibility problem. And then I talked about some runtime considerations. I converted the runtime properties file. I talked about the fact that they have 150 users and they're going to be switching from Vision to one of our native formats. And that would be either JISAM or C-Tree, and I suggested C-Tree because they have a lot of users. C-Tree is faster when you have more users. I told them that they can migrate their files before, during, or after they move to isCOBOL. We have a way to do each one of those. You don't have to do them together. And I talked about their environment. Right now it's remote desktop and map drives. I suggested that they think about using the application server for a thin client after they do their conversion. And I noted that both C-Tree and the application server are included in runtime. There's no extra cost for those. Now I have some other code analysis reports that I and my coworkers have created over the years, and I want to show you some to give you an idea of some of the other scenarios that come up. This first one was a customer who wanted to use our IDE. So when we compile their programs, we compile them in the IDE. I created a workspace and then a project, and I added their source code to it. I compiled everything. I even put the CAR document in there so that they could see it. This next one used Oracle ProCOBOL to precompile one of their programs, this PCO. And we wanted to show them that they didn't need the precompiler. So again, we showed their compile options and what each compile option did, and you can see that the PCO compiled fine. And in this particular one, we had a couple of code adjustments that we had to make. They were using a picx for an index. That's not allowed. And the other one was the SQL definition file that they use for dynamic variables. This was an issue in 2018, but now we have support for this, so this wouldn't even be an issue right now. This next one is pretty standard. They only had 2 programs. We compiled them. Same thing here, showing what we did. We did have to change they had a binary 2. We had to change it to just binary, but at the same time, we put a enhancement request into development, and now it is covered. So again, this would not be a problem now. And in this particular case, they told us that we could run the program. We didn't need data files, so we did that to show them what it would look like. Now, I don't want you to think that every code analysis report runs this smoothly. So I have one here that was not smooth. They sent us 6 programs. We were only able to compile 3 of them, and I'll explain why in a minute. We had to use a regular expression because they had a cancel sort statement, and we don't need a cancel sort statement. It's not supported and it's unnecessary. So we just took it out with a regular expression. We did compile one of them with 2 warnings. That was because the thread priority was different. It needed to be changed. The copy resource statement returned a warning. It isn't needed. It's just ignored. They used a reference modifier that started with 0 instead of 1, which isn't allowed. And it wasn't allowed in ACU either. It was one of those cases where they sent us a program that didn't compile in ACU as well. They had some ActiveX stuff, and they're going to have to deal with changing the ActiveX, because ActiveX is C-based, not Java-based, but it's also a fading technology. It's going to be supported less and less. And they had a static list combo box. We don't support that style of combo box, but when I changed the word combo box in the description to list box, it worked perfectly and looked fairly similar. So I want to talk about the ones that we could not compile. One of them sent email, and it required Outlook to be installed on every platform that ran the program. So we suggested that instead of using MS Outlook and using that Microsoft API, that they just use SendMail. It is an alternative to Outlook that's completely free, does not require any email software to be on the client side, which means that they could now run their program if they wanted to on a smartphone or a tablet using our web client. And we have a sample program. They just needed to plug in their pieces that they needed. Another one of the programs that we couldn't compile had ADO in it. And ADO is an alternative to embedded SQL. This is the code that they had to connect to the database. And we suggested that they change the code to either embedded SQL, which would be this statement right here, or just use COBOL file IO and use our EasyDB product to convert it to embedded SQL on the fly. This customer also used AccuBench, and they wanted to know whether they could continue using AccuBench. And of course they could, but we have a utility that would take an AccuBench project and convert it to an isCOBOL IDE project in just a few steps. And then they could access all of the advanced features that we have in our IDE. And there's a look at how we do a code analysis report for any prospect that requests one. I hope that you give us a chance to show how compatible isCOBOL is with your code. Thank you.